Welcome to Ecologic for the month of July. Real nice time of the year for us, kind of warm, but it's cooled down thanks to a cold front and daily rain pattern. Hopefully that doesn't dish out too much rain for us. Tonight's subject is the Hurricane Barry and the impacts it had on Acadiana and the area, and how we as volunteers work with the various parishes and Test Vermilion and the Corps to try to minimize flood impacts on our region. And thank goodness with the help from nature and timing, we think we've managed to make a big difference and lower those levels. So Dave Dixon is a volunteer who has worked with this issue with myself and other volunteers for the last 3 years, and have tried to learn from the 2016 flood, August of 2016, what happened, how it could have been managed better, and we've, I think, had some success in all the various agencies working with us, including Representative Abraham and Higgins, especially Representative Higgins' office, who has spent a lot of time with us in dealing with all those issues, and with the help of the congressman bringing some of those prominent items on the do list into actual action items. So Dave, kind of share with us your thoughts about what happened to this hurricane for Acadiana, and keep in mind that we have predictions of 15 to 16 feet of water at Surrey Bridge. We had predictions of 10 to 20 inches of rain in the Test Vermilion watershed, and didn't all land in Lafayette, but it sure landed between Opelousas and Alexandria. That rainfall was 15 to 20 inches, with more of it up in the Avoyelles Parish, with 20 inches of rain in Avoyelles. And kind of towards Evangeline Parish, we had 2022, the highest rainfall was 22.5 inches in Evangeline Parish. So to think that we missed the rainfall might be true for Lafayette, but it wasn't true for the 1 million acres in the watershed above us.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Harold. Okay, what we're going to try to do is kind of go over our analysis, like what happened, the sequence of events, the timing of the events, and our take on why we didn't reach the 15-foot predicted flood on the Vermilion that the National Weather Service predicted. And we're going to attempt to rationalize why we were able to dodge a bullet here for Barry. So with that, you want to go ahead and get started with this? You got some
Yeah,
more
absolutely.
discussion?
No,
Okay.
fine. Yes.
Well,
yes.
can we have the first slide, Roger? Okay, so the title here is How Lowered Stages in the Catawba Test Vermilion Watershed Help Save Us from Another Flood. Okay, next slide, please, Roger. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now I'll have to, some of these slides didn't come out right. We didn't realize it until we got started here, so I have to maybe read some of this for you.
Yes.
Barry, okay. We were dealing with a major river flood, and I'll get into that in just a minute. We were also dealing with a storm surge flood from the storm, from the hurricane, and we were also dealing with a major rainfall event type of flood. Next slide, please. Okay, the risk that we face for Barry. In the flood type of major river flood, the basin levels dictate the effectiveness of Catawba drainage gates in the Henderson Lake. Henderson Lake was at 17.2 feet, preventing any kind of drainage from Catawba into the Henderson Lake to the basin until after the storm rains raised the level so high in Catawba that the Corps of Engineers could finally open the gates. But that was well into the storm after that happened, okay? So in other words, we could not use the gates of Catawba to lower the levels north of us ahead of time before the storm got here. So that was one big tool in our toolbox that was stuck in the toolbox, couldn't do anything with it. We were also dealing with a storm surge. So what happens during a storm surge? Well, what happens during a storm surge is that the water actually comes up the river and prevents the river from draining to the south. I don't have any data right off that I was able to research, but Harold had some reports of the storm surge down at Sycamore Point being as high as what, Harold?
12.5 and 12.1 at Bowman Locks at Intercoastal City, which is the bottom end of the Vermilion watershed.
Right. So we were dealing with, a storm surge also.
And that storm surge started coming up Friday morning when the river was very low. It was below 3 feet, the lowest it's been in probably 30 years. And all that day, without any significant rain, the bayou is going north, and we kind of monitored 24 hours of northward flow at the Perry Bridge gauge with a very significant flow, which raised the river from below 3 to slightly above 7, probably about 4.2, 4.3 feet due to the storm surge. And that storm surge kind of crested before the rain event impact. And so Perry Bridge started flowing south at a very high rate after the storm surge kind of started going back down at Intercoastal City and that whole Bay Area.
Okay, so the last risk we were facing was a major rain event, and Barry was forecast to dump around 20 inches of rain. I'm sure everybody that lives in the area knew about that forecast. The Vermilion was forecast to crest at 15 feet at Surrey. Less than 50 miles north of Lafayette in the St. Landry Parish in Whiteville, Louisiana, it did in fact measure over 20 inches of rain. So we were very, very fortunate we didn't get that 20 inches down here. Next slide, please. Okay, now we talked about the water in the basin, okay, being high. So if you look at that picture, on the right side is the basin. Basically, the right side of the levee that you're looking at there, it's the Henderson Levee, is by Catawba inside the basin. The water level there was so high that opening those gates would not allow by Catawba to flow into the basin. Okay, even though if you look at the bottom of the picture, the borrow pit along the levee was about 1 foot elevation or basically at sea level, but there was no facility to be able to drain by Catawba into the bar pit. So we were stuck up there. We couldn't really do anything with the by Catawba drainage gates. They had to remain closed during the storm until so much rain happened up there. It finally got higher on the land side of the left side, that they were finally able to open the gates, but that was well into after the storm had passed.
Well, yeah, about 30 hours later.
Next slide, Roger. Okay. This is a picture of some storm surge at Sycamore Point where it was starting to come over the road. And the gentleman that took that picture, it was a video, and he was saying that I'm leaving now because the water came over the road just literally in minutes, coming up really, really fast. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. There's an additional risk we're facing. The frequency of flooding on the Vermilion River is dramatically increasing. At the time of Barry, we had 6 12-foot flood events in the last 24 months. And the 12-foot 6 flood event for Barry made flood number 7 for the last 24 months. And really, number 5 since January 1, which is a big, big number. In the last 7 months, we've had 5 12-foot floods or greater, 12-foot or greater floods since January 1. That is a crazy number. To give you some perspective, back in the 40s through the 80s, we would have one of these 12-foot floods about once every 4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
We've had 5 since January 1st.
We had 9 12-foot of flood events from 1940 to 1980.
Might have 9 this year.
We
by
could
the time-
easily have 9
We
in
could
one
easily
year.
have 9 by the end of the
In
year.
1 year, instead of 40 years.
Yeah. Next
We
slide.
think this is an emergency, that this data certainly indicates there's a major emergency threatening the Gadiana area.
Okay, well, I just got one slide regarding a survey the Corps did of the river. I spoke about this many, many times. This is a slide at Coulee Mean, the navigable mile around Coulee Mean. And that slide indicated that the river is nearly 100%, well, it is 100% out of spec if you want to look at both width and depth. There's very few places in the river during that nautical mile that the river meets the depth specification. In fact, right at Coulee Mean, right north of Coulee Mean, right south of Coulee Mean, there's two major shoals in the river that really act as a dam to prevent the river from flowing south. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is that frequency of flood trend that I've been updating as we go. And across the bottom are the decades, starting with the decades of the 40, and the decades all the way to this current decade where we have 9.5 years or so worth of data. We've been averaging about 1.88 12-foot floods per year. You can see those numbers up there. But you can see the numbers back in the early part of this time frame here for 40 years, we had very infrequent 12-foot floods. And we've taken a dramatic upturn in this last decade. So can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so during Hurricane Barry, we did some actions that caused the river to be lowered to the lowest level in about 40 years, ever since they turned test for million on.
Yes.
Which was about 87, I believe, or something
Yes,
like that.
87.
So, yeah, 87. Is my calculations right? Is that
Yes.
40 years or 30 years? 30 years, maybe. Okay. I'm pointing to where the National Weather Service forecast the crest to be at 15. We actually crested at 12.6. So that was a very successful effort by taking the action of cutting the pumps off. We're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute here. You want to go on to the next slide? Okay. If you look at the numbers across the top, each one of those boxes that have a number is a 12-foot flood since January 1. And that box in the middle points to the 12-foot flood level. And then you can see the June event that we had, number 4, and you see Barry's number 5. So all these events since January 1 exceeded the 12-foot level at Surrey Street, which was historically considered the flood stage.
And we had 2 additional events that reached 10. If you included the actual flood stage event, we have 7 events in 7 months.
Yeah.
Above flood stage.
They've lowered the flood stage at Surrey to 10 feet when they put Vermilionville in, I believe when they built
Yes.
Vermilionville. They lowered the flood stage. But for our comparison data, what we've done is we purged our trend that we used to do our frequency of flooding of all the 10-foot events, and we strictly using 12-foot events. So we could compare the history of the early decades that we started recording this data back in 1940. We wanted to make sure we were comparing apples to apples when we start talking about how frequently the river is flooding. So with that, can we go on to the next slide there, Roger? Okay, and so what we did, actions that were taken prior to Barry, and I'm gonna apologize for the slide, I realized it wouldn't show right. On July the 11th, Harold sent out a request to test for million
It's
freshwater.
actually July 8th.
July 8th,
July
I'm sorry,
8th.
I got my timeline wrong.
Yeah, July 8th.
To stop pumping water from the river by Catawba. All right, what happens when you stop pumping the water from the river to by Catawba? Then it allows by Catawba to drain. And normally, if the basin was low, you could drain into the basin, but the basin wasn't low, so our only outlet was to drain back through the Vermilion River. That was the only outlet. A request went out the same day to both the Corps of Engineers in St. Martin Parish to open the Keystone locks as an emergency floodgate to drain the Bayou Teche north of St. Martinville. There was a press release that was also issued at the same time. So our objective with these two actions was to try to get ahead of the water, to get the water moving, to get the water out of the system, and to restore some retention north of us.
That's a key point, is the retention in the Cocoa Bluff swamp that you drive through on I-49. It's about 25 miles of swamp that goes 2-3 miles on each side, so it's very large. And then the Thistleway swamps, the Waukesha swamps, the Darbonk swamps, and the Yellow Bayou swamps up on the Bayou de Glaze drainage canal. So all those swamps, and there's another swamp on towards Lake Chico, that's wetlands area also in that whole formula that you're lowering. So you gain probably, we actually dropped Catawba 3.1 feet at the Washington gauge, which drained those swamps, which delayed the floodwater from there coming at us at the same time the storm surge was coming at us. So there was probably a 30-hour delay, and that had a major impact on lowering levels and keeping it low.
Okay, Roger, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so what happened concerning these requests? Well, initially, both of these requests were denied. So Harold contacted President Bill Fontenot of St. Landry Parish, and Bill directed that the Teche Vermilion Freshwater District to shut down the pumps, and they did such. They stopped pumping. So the request of both the Corps of Engineers and St. Martin Parish to open the Keystone locks as an emergency floodgate to drain Bayou Teche was denied. This decision was appealed, and the issue was escalated all the way to the governor, but to no avail. Any comments on that, Harold?
Well, I think, the Corps defended themselves by referring to a March letter from the colonel, the district engineer at New Orleans, and which essentially said that the lock it was not technically possible to open the lock for flood control. And that's an alarming comment, because you can't open the lock for flood control. You probably can't open it at all. And so it denies navigation, which is a very important item. And the whole reason for the lock is navigation. And it's certainly a negative for flood control. And we wanted it open to take advantage of the very low tides we were having, which would have drained Catawba and the Teche. But to get the Teche to respond to the tide was impossible. The Teche is not connected because of this dam. And so the difference in water above the dam and the receiving water by the Lake Forest Point was almost 9 feet. The water level at the dam was 10.3, and is a little over 1 at Lake Forest Point, 15 miles away. So we could have had a much bigger impact in lowering the Teche and the Catawba to take advantage of the low tides that existed because of the 3 or 4 days of north wind.
Okay, we're gonna get into that a little more in just a minute. So can we have the next slide, Roger? Then what happened? Okay, the Vermilion River dropped to 3.6 at the Surrey gauge. This was a result of 4 things, okay? Stopping the pumps back on July the 8th, I believe.
Yes, it was
okay,
July the 8th. Yeah, the date letter went out.
All right. We had strong north winds as Barry stayed to the east of us in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was moving very slow.
Yes.
So it allowed time for those winds to push the water out of the system. And consequently, also the timing of the surge event. By the time we started seeing the surge, we had already purged the water out of the system significantly. And then the last thing, the timing of the rain event. So lastly came the rain, but by then we had already eliminated much of the water out of the system.
Especially Cypress Island, that's really important for Lafayette.
So again, this allowed the river to drain to the lowest level in many, many years, okay? Additionally, this drains Cypress Island Swamp, Bayou Catawba, and all its low-lying swamps Harold talked about in just a minute, establishing retention for the upcoming rain event. That's a real important concept. Let's talk about that a little bit more, Harold.
Well, we think of, in that whole, the 6 or 7 bayous that come into Catawba, all of them have extensive wetlands tied into it, which are swamp areas that are not part of agriculture. They are, overflow swamps at low elevation. But the text emitting system keeps those swamps pretty much full of water. And so when we quit the pumping, one of the key gauges was Washington gauge, where kind of a bunch of the bayous come together there. It went from 18.1 to right around 14.9. It dropped 3.2 feet. Yeah. And that was just according to one of the councilmen I spoke to about an hour ago. And he was so excited that the 20 inches of rain coming out of reached a peak at Washington to 28, which was about 5 feet below what it came through 016, and saved them from flooding the Walmart Center and that whole tourist center, all that area between Washington and Opelousas. Had we not drained that system, they'd have probably gone underwater again.
Because they got a big rain up there.
They got 15 to 20 inches. Whiteville had right at 20.
Yeah.
Which Whiteville is right at mile 40 going up the highway. So that's about 20 miles north of Opelousas.
All right, you want to go to the next slide, sir? We're going to talk a little bit more about the Keystone locks here. One of the things we had done about a year and a half ago is put together a plan, and that plan called for using the Keystone as an emergency flood control resource. So can we have the next slide? The next slide is a picture of the locks, and the numbers you see there are the water levels north and the water levels south of the dam. Now, the way this thing works, this facility is a very old, obsolete navigation facility that was put in the Bayou Teche back around the turn of the century, 1900s or so.
1910 it was actually put in service.
And it was there to allow steamboats to navigate up the Teche as far as, where did it?
Breaux Bridge.
Breaux Bridge, okay.
Yeah, they were hauling sugar out of the sugar mill in Breaux Bridge, and they needed the Teche to accommodate that. When low water would come, the Teche would get too low to handle that. And as I understand it, talking to the old timers in the region, that for 3 or 4 years, they squabbled over which side of the Teche would lose all its oak trees, because at that time they used bucket dredges. And so they'd have to, and finally the Corps settled it and said, well, the Teche is not a flood control feature, which was true at the time. It doesn't accommodate flood water at all, so we can just put a dam on it and a lock and raise it about 7 feet above normal, and that would accommodate, and we wouldn't have to lose all the oak trees. So people way back then, over a century ago, were quite worried about the beauty of the Teche and taking care of it and preserving it.
So a little bit more about this is that the Bayou Teche, way north of here, up in Arnoldville, Louisiana, has a branch that branches off the Bayou Teche, which is the Vermilion River, called Bayou Fuselier up there, okay? Yep. So the water levels in the Teche, what you're looking at 7.98 on the north side, actually impact the water levels in the Vermilion River. So what we were attempting to do is get the Corps of Engineers or St. Martin Parish to open the gates on the left-hand side of that picture there. You can see those, there's a gate on upstream, a gate on the downstream. To the right of those gates, there's a weir, and that's a fixed weir. That weir, water runs over that weir when it's high enough on the north side over to the south side. All right, so that's how and the Teche Vermilion pumping to Bayou Catawba, because this bayou connects directly to Bayou Catawba, provides a freshwater flow into the Bayou Teche as well as into the Vermilion, because some of the water siphoned off into the Vermilion North, up there in Arnoldville. So anyway, this were the levels right prior to, the water was very, very low because they had quit pumping already. So we thought it would be safe to open those gates and allow water to flow through to Lake Falls Point. So can we have the next slide here? Okay, and I have a little map right here. I know it's hard to see here, but to the right of Lauraville, you see where Lauraville is on the map there? To the right of Lauraville, the water, I put where it says Lake Falls Point in the lower right-hand corner, the water level was 0.7, less than 1 foot above sea level. So the water would have run down there, would have never threatened New Iberia because it was much higher in New Iberia than it was there. So it would have went down the Test Lake Canal. We had also made Test Vermilion, asked Test Vermilion to open up a control gate on that canal that connects Lake Falls Point to the Bayou Teche, and they did so. So the reason they keep that gate closed most of the time is that it would drain the Bayou Teche south of that dam, and it would go dry. It would go into Lake Falls Point when Lake Falls Point is very low. So again, Lake Falls Point is tidal, and again, we had those north winds, and the tide was helping us get Lake Falls Point way down.
Way down.
So we were attempting to get the Teche, use the Teche to drain even more water out of the system than what we were able to do with just.
Yeah, because when the water's down, the only drain is the Bayou Teche. And so the Teche is kind of critical in this. And when you put a dam on a waterway, it makes an impoundment, essentially a lake. So you have a long lake, because the natural spoil banks on the Teche are very high, so it's confined in that. And there's virtually no inflow into the Teche except from Port Barrett. There's no side inflow to it, so it's kind of a unique water body. But to put a dam on it might be great, you know, to haul barges up the Broad Bridge to the sugar mill, but the sugar mill's gone. And the last commercial lockage, a vessel that went through it, was 1992. It had 600 yards of shell that they sent to Parks, Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not used for navigation at all. In fact, all the canoes that go down for the annual canoe trip has to portage around that lock. And we think that's a real problem, the lock. We have a lot of money invested in that and in maintaining it, and it should be open to navigation because it's the only reason it's there.
Can you back up one slide there? Can you go back to the previous slide? All right, well, after the flood of 93, a little more history on this thing right here. After the flood of 93, the Corps of Engineers looked at what happened in 93 and recommended to either put a gate here or remove it. Well, there's a story about why that didn't happen. Now, you want to tell the story, Harold?
Well, the Mark Wingate, who is now the chief civilian in the New Orleans district of the Corps of Engineers, had computer modeled this whole issue, and his plan called for deepening the Vermilion beyond its design depth from 11 feet to 13 feet, and to increase the width from 100 to 125 feet. And then to take out the keystone, and then to put a canal on the south end of Cypress Island and drain it into the Bayou Teche for a quick, short trip to Lake Falls Point. That model, the computer model that was done on it, indicated that taking those steps in a worst-case flood event with lower stages in Lafayette at 6 to 8 feet. And keep in mind, Lafayette was a big push behind this study because Lafayette was the major victim in this 93 flood. Didn't have big problems in Abbeville, didn't have big problems up in St. Landry and the parishes above, but Lafayette got whacked. And it went to 15.7 in Lafayette and flooded probably about 500 or 600 homes. And so Lafayette was concerned and had at the time the governor's ear and the political clout to muster all efforts of the Corps to try to resolve this, including a trip to meet the the general who was in charge of the Mississippi River Commission, and he made an interesting comment that when the levee was built in 1935, that prevented the floodwaters in this whole system from going in either the Red River or the Chaffly Basin. And now we're sending it all down to little old Bayou Teche. And he said in 1935, the first thing you should have done was taken that dam out. And he said we should have been dealing with, you know, making sure that the Lake Foss Point system plumbing was intact to do what it was designed to do, the big watershed for this whole Teche-Vermilion flood system.
Yeah, let's, there was a, so what happened how come it never got took out? As Mark Wingate
well, Mark Wingate in a public meeting in St. Martinville announced this whole plan, $60 million plan, which evidently at the time they had support for it from Congress, from the Mississippi River Commission and New Orleans District, and the sheriff at the time, you know, he stopped the proceeding when Wingate announced this and asked for an immediate recess, and took Mr. Wingate in the back room and said, we do not want to take the Bayou Teche and turn the beautiful Bayou Teche into a ditch with no water in it. We're not about to allow y'all to take this lockout. And he says, if you could persist on this, I'm gonna have my deputies haul you to jail right now. And so that was the end of the plan. You know, the sheriff wanted to keep water in his backyard. He wanted to look out the back door of his house on the Teche and see water in it. So don't worry about flooding 8,000 homes. Just make sure the sheriff can see water back there.
Yeah. I guess he didn't realize what was gonna happen in 16.
Well, he was very, you know, he took a self-serving position on it.
All right, you wanna go to back to the next slide again? We'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, over there to the right of Loraville is the Lake Foss Point. Just for people that may not be aware that when the Corps built the levee systems, that was designed to be our floodplain. That's a big low area, a couple hundred square miles, barely above sea level.
Actually averaged about -3 elevation.
Yeah, so it's real, it could take a lot of water. Well, the problem we're having right now is getting the water there. That's the problem right now. You know, we got maintenance issues, we got changes, but that have unintended consequences. So we cannot send the water down there in the most efficient manner right now. So just a key point to understand about that whole low area is on the land side of the levee, the Henderson levee. So if you went down south of Henderson, you would be driving, looking at the basin on the left and this big low area on the right, which kind of looks like the basin, okay?
Looks exactly
like the basin.
Looks a lot better than the basin right now.
Yeah.
In fact, the elevation of the basin average is 14 foot higher than the bottom of this system.
Right.
For lots of reasons, that's all changed.
We could put a lot, I think the highest the water came down in Lake Foss Point during the Barry event was maybe about 4.7 feet above sea level.
Right, yeah.
So it's insignificant.
And it can go, its high point was 1953 where it went to 7.8. And the August flood pushed it about 6.6. So, you know, we still could put a lot more water in it. And at 6.6, it didn't flood anybody at, you know, at Coda Homes or up around Catahoula. All of that was not an issue. It did flood the buildings in the park, but I think that's a design issue. The Lake Foss Point buildings was set at, I think, 5. And they should have, if they looked at the old core Bible that I have sitting here on my desk, the high point there is 7.8, which is June of 1953. And I think the design engineers and architects should have known that, put the houses at 3 feet above that.
Okay, so can we go to the last slide there? Okay. As a summary, you know, my comment is, while we avoided a major flood event for Barry, we should not count on stopping the Teche-Vermilion freshwater district pumps. to save us again. We can't do that. We were just very fortunate that we were able to get that done. Very fortunate that we had a big north wind. Very fortunate that the tide came at the right time. The storm surge
and the flood
and the
was
rain's
separated
coming.
by almost 24 hours.
And the rain came at the right time. We had time to get the water out of the system. We have a 7-point plan of projects to reduce the risk of another major flood event in our watershed, and we'd ask the public for support for our plan. And with that, if anybody has any questions, we will attempt to answer.
And one of the key points of this plan is the dredge of Vermilion. We think that the Vermilion, as surveyed by the Corps 2 years ago, probably has changed and has even become more shallow, because in that time we've had 9 or 10 12-foot flood events, and each one brings sediment to those already shallow areas. And I know that because at 12 feet it goes over my pier, and I have to get the mud off of it when the water goes down, which is usually a quarter to a half inch of material. And so I think that's landing at these shallow spots, and a bad situation is getting constantly worse. And part of that, if we looked at why the shoal area is occurring, we'd almost have to tie directly to our very efficient, super high speed, self-clearing concrete coolers. These things come at the river, at the bayou, run in at 8 or 10 miles an hour, and then the bayou is moving at 1 mile an hour. And so the sediment that's careening down at high speed into the bayou cannot be carried off by the bayou. It just lands in the bottom and fills and fills and fills. So we think that, when you look at frequency of flooding, there's probably numerous things that cause that. The Red River impoundment, which stopped the water from Rapides Parish from going into the Red River and brought it to us. The close of the Mighty Glaze Gate, which pumped a lot more water to us. And then the shoaling of the Vermilion, and probably some other factors. But those are some of the 3 most important ones. And the one we can do and fix the quickest probably is the dredging of the bayou, especially on an emergency basis, which we think an emergency should be declared, to immediately bucket dredge those sandbars out. And that can be put on a barge if we have to. So we have a call, let's see if we can get it. You on there? Can we help you?
Yes, what can we do to get this plan underway? I mean, there's more than just opening or shutting off the pumps at the Catawba. What's it going to take to make it happen?
Well, for instance, very important that these public decisions are made by public officials. And they all have telephones, and they all get the mail, and they get emails, and just send a word to them. A handwritten letter to your congressman, a handwritten letter to the governor, and we're going to get the government involved because we want an emergency declaration, which will bypass a lot of the bureaucratic baloney and make things happen. That's our hope. And so a note to the governor, a note to your area representatives who refuse, your people you sent to Baton Rouge refuse to get involved in this, and that's a travesty because they have an important voice, and there's 9 parishes involved. If those 9 parish senators and representatives get together in lockstep, they can rule the world around them. But they refuse to even be involved. So you might write a letter to them. They're all running for re-election now. Say maybe you need to be a little more active in this to help prevent a catastrophic flood as occurred in 2016.
Yeah. I'll make a couple comments about that. I wish they would be paying attention to what's going on with the river. I think some of the more recent 5 events since January 1 can be actually attributed to some of the work the parishes are doing that are increasing the flow into the river, and the river is becoming progressively more plugged up.
So we have another call coming. Thank you so much for the call.
Okay.
Yeah, I have the call. You on air? Can you, welcome.
This is a call from Ithaca, New York.
All right, Mr. Vic, how can we help you?
Well, we would like to know why there've been so many major flood events.
I'm going to let Dave answer that because I think it's multiple causes. And, you know, you can look up the system, some of the things we did to handle the successful, you know, program of the Test for Million may have been a problem for flooding. Those things can be resolved. The Test for Million is super important. It has done a fantastic job of improving water quality and preventing salinity intrusion into the Chico Aquifer and into the rice farms and fields. The closing of the Bayou Rapids into the Red River, because you raised the Red River 20 feet, the closing of the Bayou de Glaze Gate, the shoaling of the Vermilion, all those things we think are contributing factors to a increased flooding event. Dave, you might want to
Yeah,
comment?
I was beginning to talk about the spike up since January 1. So I wanted to take a look at, you know, why is that? Why is it dramatically spiked up since January 1? And I think there's a couple things going on here. Okay, the number one, you know, the parishes are moving forward with their efforts to clean out their coulees and their ditches full speed ahead. Okay, well, whenever you do that, you increase the speed of the runoff into the river, and a river that's already plugged. Another thing about cleaning the coulees and the ditches is that you create a lot of unconsolidated material when you start digging on the banks. And that unconsolidated material, you know, in a rainstorm, shoots right down the coulee into the river. So we're probably getting more and more deposition on these sandbars in the river and these shoals, and it's causing these shoals to become even worse than they were before. I took a look at the rainfall since January 1 up until today. Now, I didn't have today's data in it, but it rained again today. And using Lafayette Airport data, we've had about 40 inches of rain since January the 1st. Is that out of the norm? It's a little higher than normal, but I saw the forecast. This is National Weather Service data. The forecast is to end the year at 60 or so, okay, which is in the ballpark, because I think our average rain
55 to 60 is our normal.
That's our normal rainfall. Now, I do know that some of the rainfall events seem to be more extreme when we do have them, okay? Monsoon-like rainfall events. When rain comes down, the one this afternoon was like that down where I live.
And it punched the bayou up at Broussard Bridge and at Surrey Bridge.
And the river just spikes. If you watch the gauges, you'll see after these rain events, the river just spikes straight up. So my argument is we're doing this kind of backwards. We need to be fixing the receiver of the water, the river, and in conjunction with dredging the coulees, in conjunction, we can use some retention in key places. But really, the detention is not a long-term solution for major rain events like we had in 16. All one has to do is look at the volumes. And I've looked at the volumes. The volumes that went down the river, the volumes that went down the Tesh during 16 were astronomical. We're talking million acre feet of water. You would need a retention lake the size of Vermilion Bay to be able to handle something like that.
The size of Lafayette Parish.
Thank you, sir. We have another call coming in.
You on the air? Can we help you?
Yes. I wanted to make a couple of comments about your show. First of all, I live on Cooley Mine, right between those two humps on the river that you talked about. So I experience very closely the events when it rains very hard, and I watch as the river runs backwards. I was struck by the fact that the three of the major points of your plan have been around since 1993. The Mark Wingate plan that apparently got shut down by the sheriff in St. Martin Parish, and that was dredge the Vermilion, put a canal from Cypress Island Swamp to Lake Foss Point, and take out the Keystone Dam. And it's been 27 years now that we've allowed that situation to deteriorate from 1993. And it's kind of amazing that nothing's been done in that regard on that. And so that's very dramatic, I think.
You raise a very strong point that in '93 we knew we had to dredge the Vermilion, and it's almost criminal that it hadn't happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. And secondly, the only thing that we're hearing from our local government officials, the Lafayette Consolidated Government people, is clean the coulees and dig detention ponds. And I'm not against those things. I think those are things that will help. But if you clean the coulees without dredging the river, it's just a recipe for a catastrophe. So I think that any candidate who wants to run for Lafayette Consolidated Government president needs to make a commitment to the community that he will or she will not do one before the other. In other words, you can, if you do it contemporaneously, that's great. If you dredge the Vermilion and then clean the coulees, that's great. But if Mark Wingate's plan had been implemented, it appears to me, you can tell me whether or not you agree, but if Mark Wingate's plan had been implemented in 1993 or shortly thereafter as he intended for it to be, and this is a United States Army Corps of Engineers expert guide. This isn't some, layperson making this up. Anyway, if that would have been done, they could clear the coulees to their heart's content and concrete them to death, and I think we could handle the water and go right down to Vermilion, and we could get the water out. But because we neglected that plan, we can't. It's dangerous to do that. That's just my comment. One other thing.
Your comment's real good, but because, had that been implemented, we wouldn't be talking about this on this program.
Right, we wouldn't have had it in 16.
We wouldn't have had a 16 flood that flooded 8,000 homes in the Tetra Vermilion watershed.
And I have a confession to make. Our plan is basically Mark Wingate's plan with some updates, with a few extra projects and some updates to the situation. Okay,
that's exactly right.
So we're building. What we're recommending is building on work that was already done, an extensive study that was done after the '93 flood.
You're absolutely right with the priorities. The first thing we do here is dredge the Vermilion.
We have another call coming in.
And that is truly what you hear a lot of people give lip service to the idea of a regional, comprehensive, multi-parish approach, and then they talk about cleaning coulees and digging detention ponds. Well, that might have some minor impact on the region and all the multi-parish, and you could call it comprehensive, kind of like emptying your bathtub with a thimble, but it really doesn't do anything that significant. But the Wingate plan that you guys have resurrected and adopted and pushed, that has credibility, and it really does have a regional, comprehensive, multi-parish approach. One final thing, I don't want to monopolize the deal, but how many houses do you think did not flood because we're able to get Tetra Vermilion freshwater project to shut off the pumps and lower the Vermilion to 13.6 feet in anticipation of Barry? In other words, because the Vermilion only got to 12.5 or 6.6 feet instead of 15 feet. Any estimate on that?
Well, if it actually went to 15, we'd have had hundreds of homes flood. And say $100,000 a house, that's $10 million.
Yeah, I would think. Yeah, if it came to 15, they were saying 15 to 16, worst case 16, probably from St. Landry Parish down to Vermillion, you're probably looking at 2,000 homes, worst case.
Well, that's literally
What-
a couple $100 million.
Absolutely.
That we saved by just getting them to shut that off. So
What-
I think you guys have done a great job. I think you've established that you do know what you're talking about. And you proved it when you got them to lower the river. And the people in charge should follow the other points of your plan, and I guess the old Wingate plan, which is, you know, you guys, and dredge the Vermillion and put a canal from Cypress Island and do these other things with the gates, so we really can manage the Vermillion, you know, from 4
Yep.
to 8 feet every time we get a flood event, because these things are coming at us more
Right.
frequently and stronger than ever. And all we've done is make the situation worse by allowing the Vermillion to continue to silt up and get shallower and shallower, placing more and more people at risk in the watershed. So
No question. Thank you so much for
Thank
your
you for your
comments and
comments.
support. Thank you, sir.
keep doing a good job.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, sir.
You know, my comment
probably
is
missed
that
the call.
frequency of flooding is the
We have another
canary
call.
in the coal mine.
You on air? Can we help you?
Yeah, Harold,
Yes.
this is Jim Schamberger. How you doing?
Very good, sir. Thank you so much for calling in, Brother Jim.
Yeah, how you doing? Anyway, I got a question. What is the procrastination between our elected officials and the Army Corps of Engineers, and both Lafayette Parish, St. Martin Parish, Vermillion Parish, on the Vermillion River drainage area? Undoubtedly, the solution has been out there for years. Everybody pretty well recognized what has to be done. Whether it's to take out the dam on the Tesh, dredge the Vermillion River, a few of these other projects to prevent these issues. I'm 63 years old, and they've been talking about doing this for years, and nothing has been done. Now we're reaping the results of it. And I'm just curious. It seems like it'd be a win for every politician, every elected official in town or in the parish to get on board with this thing with the solution. They would be heroes. I don't understand it. Can y'all shed some light on that, please?
I think, Jim, on a lot of these issues, you have pushback. For instance, the dredging by Army around Catahoula Lake is kind of important. It's gotten real shallow, and it holds a lot of water Lake Lost Point. The hang-up is where the spoil is being put. And they've been sitting on this permit a year and a half. My guess is some big property owner adjoining would love to have that spoil on their land and to get paid for it, to put it on their land. So invariably, when permits don't happen, there's some kind of self-serving pushback. And I would think we probably have that issue sitting around on the Vermillion, either a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. When we first came up with the comments that the bayou was getting too shallow, the administration here in Lafayette said we had no idea, they had no idea that there was no problem with the Vermillion. It was plenty deep, and we didn't know what we were talking about. Well, a few months later, the Corps released their complete study where they measured the bayou from Southwest Pass to Interstate 10, and they measured it every 100 feet all the way across with about a $600,000 study that confirmed our thoughts that the river was getting too shallow. Now that we know it's too shallow, and we have absolute proof that it's too shallow, that's been 2 years past. Nothing has been done yet. Mm-hmm. And some of the pushback on that is Vermillion Parish doesn't want Lafayette's water. Well, I got news for Vermillion Parish. It ain't Lafayette's water. It's Avoyelles' water. It's Alexandria's water. It's St. Landry's water. It's Evangeline water. It ain't just ours. Our contribution to the flood is minuscule. Lafayette contribution to that watershed is only 21,000 acres in a 1.2 million acre watershed. So it's hard to understand why, and part of it I think is people think about the flood only in terms of parish lines, and that's a real problem. And I can give credit to Bill Fontenot and to St. Martin Parish, St. Mary Parish, some of the other parishes are looking beyond the parish line and saying, we're all in this together, and we gotta pull together. So, thank you, Jim. We got about a 1 minute left. Thank you so much for the call, Jim. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, the Corps says we gotta get all the parishes on the same page. That's been their consistent.
Well, I talked to Harold Taylor just before this show, and his comment was exactly that. He said, we're gonna pull all these parishes together, and they all gotta be on the same page. So we're gonna be meeting with them next Wednesday, and that's Bill Fontenot and the leadership in St. Landry Parish wants to bring in Boyles, wants to bring in Rapides, Evangeline, and St. Martin, and sit at the table and get these issues resolved in one voice and get things done. So
Right.
my hat's off to Harold Taylor and Bill Fontenot for being leaders in resolving these issues. So,
5 seconds.
so Dave, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you,
all
Harold.
the people who called in. We appreciate all your support and help in